Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. In this video, we're going to continue along the Roland theme, only this time we're not in the cloud. We're looking at TAL's U-NO-LX version 2. Now, this is one of the sounds that defined the 80s. It's also sadly become a sound that's kind of undefined the 80s. It's the Stranger Things sound. But the Juno 60 is a lovely synth that, while actually very limited, becomes a rather nice thing. Let's take a little bit of a look at it in action. Now, this is the piece that, if you watched the TAL sampler video I did, this is literally the same piece, only rather than using TAL sampler, wherever possible, so that's the exception of drums, I replaced them with the U-NO clone, which is more appropriate to saying, okay, if we did this in 1982 or 1983, whilst we were trying desperately to be the Twins or Depeche Mode, then this is probably what it would have sounded like. After I'd done it, I realised that probably the Sim-Toms, the Simmons sounds, should not have been there. They should also have been a U-NO sound as well, but they are there, and at least technically they could have been there if we happened to be friends with someone who had a set of Sim-Toms. You'll also notice that the mini pops don't go backwards because they wouldn't have gone backwards at that time. Technically, they could have if we had a Fairlight or something like that, but sitting at home trying desperately to become the Twins, as I say, you just wouldn't have had it. Now, the sound that this synth became known for was largely that. It's not the only sound it could make. It was actually really nice, as you will hear, bit of an all-rounder, but that's the sound that it's been kind of lumbered with, which is understandable because it does it very well, but it's also a little bit of a shame. Putting that aside, we should look at some of the history. The Juno 60 is a pretty important turning point in synthesizer history. It was one of the first instruments that saw digital control of a VCO. So a VCO is no longer a VCO, as in voltage controlled, and therefore prone to acting like a soccer lout on a Saturday night. It became under digital control, so it was constantly being tuned by the digital clock. And that made them far more reliable. As I read somewhere, it was, or even here, that it actually says, it was about the first instrument you could just pick up out of your bedroom, walk it onto stage and play it, and it'd actually probably work. Because a lot of instruments were very, very unreliable. Story goes that Joy Division would take 5 Prophets with them in the hope that one of them worked on the night. This was not uncommon. It was very hard to be a synthesizer band back then. A lot of people didn't realise how hard, and absolutely don't realise how hard now it is, because it's so easy that anybody with a telephone can pretend to be a synth band with no effort or cost. And while we may go, oh, but that's a wonderful thing about progress, there's also a problem in that, in the sense that we don't realise the power we've got, and therefore we don't realise the negative impact of that power to actually damage our ability to value what we've got and make the most of it. And this is an instrument that benefits you far more when you realise how to work with the limits than to say, it doesn't have everything I want. So the last video we looked at Roland Cloud, and I walked you through and showed you how really their architecture hasn't changed from sort of SH1 or something like that right the way through to their modern gear. They kind of haven't changed. Now, there was a watershed moment in the early 80s, as you see here in this article. The Roland realised that they were behind. Other manufacturers were going digital, and they had no digital technology that they owned. They went to the fellow behind what became Yamaha's FM and then discovered that Yamaha already bought it. And they'd got nowhere to go to compete with the digital synthesizer that was coming through, and very likely looked like it could roll them up. So they doubled down on what they were already good at, which was analog. And as I said, they worked out how to get analog better behaved, which was the DCO. So keep the analog filters, but put the synth itself under digital control, so it gave you the advantages of the warm analog sound whilst minimizing the disadvantages of analog drunkenness, which was a real problem when you went to a hidden key and it was just completely the wrong note. I had a Moog Slim Fatty, and you had to leave it for about 20 minutes before you could play it, and if you did play it before then, God knows what you would get. So Roland said, okay, we'll focus on this, and they've continued to focus on that for the rest of, well, up till now, which, as we talked about last time, can make them seem less than inspiring in terms of being adventurous, but it also means they majored in what they do, and that was that Roland sound I kept talking about. And this was one of those watershed instruments that went from being kind of unreliable and difficult to deal with to suddenly beginning to be decent to deal with, and also the beginning of what would become MIDI. To you now, that probably seems absurd that there was a time before MIDI, and you may not even know what MIDI is, but this was Roland's system that they were building, where they could provide you with a sequencer. It's a big beast too, it was heavy. My friend had one that lived in my studio for some time. You could kill people with that thing. And you could plug it in the back, and suddenly the micro composer became the thing that played everything that you wrote. So really important instrument used by just about everybody. And as we were getting towards the end of the 80s, as these things were coming up on the used market for cheaper prices, as people were moving into newer things, into a lot of digital stuff, then they were very easy to pick up cheap for the next generation. So that was the second generation of high energy guys, the guys who had seen bands like the Twins have success with Not the Lovin' Kind and Ballet Dancer, and that became high energy, the second wave of that. So I don't want to specifically pick on any names because I'm probably technically wrong, but that's where you got Brian Ice and all those kinds of guys, Hey Hey Guy, and this was all over those things. And then, of course, everybody wants me to say the techno names grabbed these things, and this was the thing they could afford, and that's part of how it became the new sound going forward. TAL, we've spoken about several times, because I've covered a few of their products, partly because they've been good enough to actually put themselves forward into the fray and dare themselves against my ire. So they have provided us with all their catalogue, actually. So that's why we've looked at them quite a lot. But also, we try very much to have a policy of looking at good products. There have been a couple of times where I've started reviews and they've been pulled because we've realised that the product is not good, not honourable. And that's probably better to not go down that path. We don't want to encourage that. Whereas TAL's products are actually good, and they work nicely, and they're nicely priced. So the TAL-U-NO-LX, there was an earlier free version, but this is the newer version, and it's newer and better. So while you can still download the free older version, it's not quite the equal of this device. They say they actually have one of their own that they've sort of worked this against to try and make it seem like as close as possible to that. How accurate it is, I don't know, because I've actually never had the chance to have or even poke a Juno 60. In my life, they have been a non-existent thing. Closest I've come is 106s, but I think the 106 and the 60 are quite different beasts. So it's not fair. People will say, oh, but how accurate is it? And I, as I've done in the past, go, I don't want to go down that road. I'll take this for what it is, because a real Juno 60, if we put three of them in a room, we've got three different instruments. So this kind of thing is like Does it work nicely? Is it going to sit in a mix? Is it going to behave well? Is it going to give us something great for the price? I think so. Price in US dollars is 60. If we're going to pay tax on it, depending upon what country you're in, 66. So it comes in Australian dollars about $90. Not the cheapest thing out there, but by far not the most expensive thing out there. You easily pay sort of 150, 160 US dollars for things that don't do any more. And TAL has a little bit of a habit of putting in some nice improvements. Generally, improvements in these sorts of things make me very nervous because they often move you away from the charm of the original. But the improvements in here seem pretty good. Before we go further, let's get into the good and bad, and then you can decide whether my opinion is right as we walk through the device itself. Oh, and if I didn't mention it before, or you need the reminder, the full track, which is the revoice of the TAL sampler track, will be at the end of this. So you can go watch the whole thing and have an opinion of how it sounds. Good and bad. It sounds great. Again, don't care whether it sounds like a real one or not. All I care is if I put this into my track, is it going to work? Yes, it works. It sounds great. It's easy to program. There is a little bit of having to learn its way, but that's the Roland way. And if you watch the Cloud video, you'll see that Roland way and I have not always been the most comfortable, but there's a lot of sense in the device. It is easy to program if you're starting with synths and you want to start at the beginning with a simple instrument that's capable but not going to be dragging you off into doing silly things, and you're not making that mistake of thinking that's true synthesis yourself or the core of synthesis, then this is a great place to be. One of the things that is great, and I will show you, is his service control panel. As I said, there are a couple of things he's done which put him in the right direction towards adding value, and the service control panel appears on a couple of his devices, winning. The bad, well, I'm pushing everything uphill to try to suggest that there's realistically anything bad about this. We can point to a limited feature set. Firstly, seeing it's a clone of an instrument, adding a lot of extra features is questionable. So limited feature set is, this is the device that he's building. He's not built a new, bells and whistles. He's built a Juno 60. This is the Juno 60 feature set, give or take some little modifications that he may have made. Plus, as I pointed out before, if we start to alter the feature set, the resulting sounds that we get, while we may be able to say, well, that's the Juno oscillator and the Juno filter, are not going to actually be Juno 60 sounds because they weren't possible on that device. So while, yes, I can look at this and go, oh, but wouldn't it be nice if? A lot of the strength in it comes from the fact that you can't, so you have to find a way to do it with what you do have. And brutal crushing limits are the thing that builds great artists. So if you look at it and go, oh, it doesn't have enough features for me, okay, fair enough. If you're going to go off and buy a really powerful synth, or get yourself a Thor or a Europa, yeah, great, you'll have more stuff. If you don't know what you're going to do with those things, yeah, you could get horribly lost and confused. But in the meantime, if you're starting out and saying, this is where I'm going to go, yeah, do this. And those limits will actually make you stronger given time. Righto. The device itself. One of the things that I like straight away is that I don't like their default preset patch. I just don't like it at all. So I can replace that with one that I do like. Very nice, very nice. There's nothing more annoying to me than opening a synth and the default sound is somebody else's idea of what's a good idea. I like that it can be my idea of what's a good idea. We can get into MPE, we can get into micro-tuning. Great. Not interested, but great that we can do it. You're going to have to read the manual on that. I actually forgot to even look. There is a manual. It's a little simplistic. It's a little self-obvious. The filter knob controls the filter, but it is worth reading. You'll pick up stuff. I picked up a few things that I was like, oh, okay. So it's worth reading. You can get into presets and what have you. It's very nicely resizable. There are preset banks, which we're really not going to get much into. There is a preset bank that emulates the original sounds on the device. How accurate again? I don't know, but they feel realistic enough, bearing in mind that in the digital world, you just don't have the limits of the loss from jacks, putting it into a poor quality desk, or God forbid, a Portasound, and all the loss that comes out of that to make the real sound of the times. But it seems realistic. The presets in here do seem quite realistic to what you probably would have got. The organs are quite nice, obviously limited in terms of trying to behave as a real B3, but nice. Give ourselves a little bit of the old. And we could quickly find ourselves want to be starting something. So, pretty decent spread of presets. Won't get into all of them, play around with them. Okay, let's go back to our default and start to look at the device. Kind of an anemic sounding oscillator at the gate. Roland's saws were not necessarily the nicest. Where they really hung their hat was on their pulse oscillator. So, sorry, we can put into manual. They don't go to nothing, which is sort of a failing, but understanding how they hung their hat on a pulse gives us a really good idea. So Roland's Juno pulse sound, once you get the pulse width modulation going with that LFO, gives you that really fat, engaging sound, and that's sort of central to these guys. Sometimes you'll use just the saw, but the pair of these guys together, subs, or now my understanding is that these are phase locked, just like the SHs, so you've got really one oscillator that's synced. So when you add these two waveforms, they're actually working exactly together. So your classic analog synth would tend to be two oscillators. This is why they're in one DCO. You'd have two oscillators, and when you trigger them, the phase of these two shapes would be constantly out with each other, which is part of where you get that wide sound from. But these are tide locked, so when you start them, they're always starting in exactly the right place. And while that can reduce some of the fatness, you get that back with the pulse width. But it also gives you a much tighter sort of sound. So if we which is why they're so popular for bass machines, because they always start in the same spot. So they actually behave like samplers more than the synths that came before, and that gives you that very tight, very controlled bass, which is a very popular thing. It can be a liability if you're looking for the earlier analog type sound, as I'm prone to, but if you want that really tight, controlled bass, that can be small but push through your mix better, then this kind of tide-locked oscillator is a great way of doing it. Oh, we've covered our DCO, and of course our ability to add vibrato to it. We can also add noise, which means we can turn off any of our oscillator forms and just have noise. There's a high-pass filter. Hacks off the bottom end of the sound. You might think, why would I ever want to do that? Well, obvious one is for strings. It clarifies them tremendously. You don't want a huge amount of on the bottom of your string sounds because they won't get that light, airy feel. So your high-pass filter you'll use for that, but you'll be amazed with basses, flubby, tighter. So there's good reason to use your high-pass filter. Just take your time with it. Then we've got our low-pass filter, which is our obvious low-pass. We'll get rid of the envelope for the moment. This might get noisy. So it's a fun filter. Sometimes I feel like it's a little bit nothing different's happening on the top end, but again, that's a Roland thing. It's not a thing I've loved, but it's a Roland thing. We've got our envelope, but you'll note that there is only one envelope on this synth, and that's always been my first thought of like, But when you stop thinking about what's missing and start going with what you can do, you find that it becomes really rather cool and is part of the reason for the Juno sound. If we bring in our very much makes us want to be kids in America, doesn't it? That's what you get as a result of this combination. So the envelope can be set to gate or set to follow the envelope. And your envelope is then set to control your filter. So to get that classic sound, the Ricky Wilde thing, or the sound that you hear is up with arpeggios all over everything, then you actually leave the ADSR in gate mode, which means it just turns on, stays on, turns off. No release, no nothing. And then your envelope is controlling the filter. And there's endless fun to be had with that. The reason that you hear so many songs with this kind of stuff put in the middle of them through that 80s period and now but now they're often doing it to try to ape that period. But the reason you hear this through so many songs is it's a lovely sound, and it fills out what's an otherwise fairly simple mix. Because when you're a fairly not very well paid band, as in not the Eagles, and you're going into a studio and you're looking to make a rich sounding record on a fairly tight budget, because most of these early 80s, well, new wave bands, the pop bands, had limited budgets. So being able to take in a device that gave them this kind of richness was a wonderful thing. Being on stage, they could just have the keyboard player doing this sort of stuff, and suddenly they had the sound. Your filter can react to the envelope upside down. So you can get a lot of those kinds of cool sounds out of that. So if you're thinking, oh, it's limited, try turning it the other way up. That also answers if when you encounter that thing and you're going, how do they make that sound? That's kind of weird. There's a fair chance they had their envelope upside down. And notice how you're getting that really nice click. It's giving you unrealistic sounds that will just grab attention and hold it so nicely in the mix. Really nice. Yes, I'm borrowing from Tangerine Dream from Phaedra, but it's a really nice thing with the one LFO to assign some to pitch and some to filter. Really nice. You don't seem to be able to assign it to level offhand. Maybe you can. I don't recall seeing it. Doesn't really matter, but it's limited, but there's cool stuff you can do. So the other thing is a keyboard control. So bright up the top, duller down the bottom. Or brighter down the bottom. So if you're playing chords or chords spread like that, and you're going, oh gee, the bottom is overpowering the top, then you can use your keyboard. So if you find that, oh, I seem to be having imbalance between top and bottom of the keyboard, then your key follow is your solution there. Yeah, we've talked about the VCA, how that can be assigned to be being controlled. So your level, the volume of your sound over time, can be controlled by this one ADSR. So to get actual polyphonic sounds like this, that are slow on the intro and have got release, you need to use the envelope. which means it's now doubling with whatever your filter is doing. That chorus. It's quite a limited chorus in that you've got 3 options, or 4 options. You can have it off. You can have chorus 1, chorus 2, and both in. So yes, if you need to do Oxygen and Equinox clones, that's how. Those choruses are either great or just not great. There's not much in between with them, but they're on board and they are part of that Juno sound. So you try them. If they're working, great. If they're not, that's all right. Use outboard gear. We've got our LFO assigned. Let's assign a little bit to the filter as well. There's kind of a fluty sound, but if we're playing a fluty type thing or a string thing, we don't always want our LFO to come in straight away. So let's overdo it. So it ramps in after a period of time. Some of those delays will leave it off entirely and then suddenly it turns on. Some will ramp in this way, some will ramp in this way. So it allows the beginning of your sound to come through clean and then soften up. So if you want a sound that feels like it flows, then you're probably going to want to do something like that. Our trigger modes for our LFO is that they can re-trigger, so start their duty cycle, as in begin their shape, when you press the key. Which is very regular in a certain kind of a way, in more of a digital synth kind of way. But when we play a chord like this without the keys all being pressed at exactly the same time, they're all pulsing together as one pulse. But we can hear there are 3 pulses there, so they create a more complex feel. So trade off. If you want a more classic analog synthesizer feel, then you leave it to free. If you want to go a little modern and have a slightly richer feel, then you can go to key. There is also sync, which everybody knows I am not a fan of. Use that for, I don't know, something boring. Your shapes. Sine, triangle. Sine's probably the most common one, but if you're finding that it's a little excessive, you know, that your vibrato always just feels a bit too much, move it to triangle. Hear how nice that is? Because your sine is closer to a square. On, off, on, off, on, off. Your sine is a little closer to that. Whereas your triangle may be a little less natural, but it will give you a softer feel. So if you're struggling with always feeling like that there isn't enough space to, you know, pull it down without losing your modulation, then move to triangle. Hear how in this case the rise of the cycle is always the same. Here it's a bit different every time. Swings and roundabouts as to what you want to do. And we can turn our waveform upside down. So with the saw there, if it's climbing and you want it to actually fall, then just use the old inverterini. I can't remember what manual. Ah, that's what that means. I'd forgotten that one. Yes, so with manual mode, I play my note, nothing happening. So that's like a mod wheel, only it's a mod button. Because this doesn't have a mod wheel. There is no mod wheel to assign things to. So if you want to get into having a little bit more hands-on control, you've got the manual button to do that, which is kind of cool. And of course random. And that sounds lovely. Really, really lovely. It's very hard to do that with most standard VA synths. Much as I have a deep and enduring relationship with Thor, Thor just does not sound like this. Let's just go back to a triangle. Ah, that's here. That's our LFO done. Portamento, which is sliding. We've got off, in which case there is none. That actually puts you into a monophonic mode. And that's legato. So the number 1 is... So you have to be holding the first key when you press the second one. Always is... Doesn't matter whether you're holding them or not, it's going to slide. And of course you can set your time. That's just such a lovely sound. I know it may seem to you far too 70s, but if we're thinking of this kind of thing, again, it should be very easily doable to get something that feels like that out of Thor, but it kind of doesn't. That's wonderful. It really is. You've also got a way of changing the time scale. So it changes the scaling of the time and how it glides between the two notes. Read the manual to understand that, because if you're playing with glide, but feeling like it's not gelling right, then you could well be a case not so much of time here as a slider, but time here as in how it moves. So it can mean you refactoring your thing here. But that puts you into mono mode. If you don't want to be in mono mode, then you press poly. And you hear that used in my demo piece. So that lets you have chords always slide. In terms of, there is some controller stuff. Some of this is not legitimate Juno 60 because this allows us to do things with the more advanced MIDI and now oncoming MPE control. Now this is all from your pitch wheel, so we can set how far that slides. I love the way this is flat, it doesn't even pretend to be 3D. Just slides up and down. So you can set how far. And you can set odd numbers there as well. Normally a pitch wheel amount will say how many semitones. This lets you put weird amounts in, which is kind of cool. If you want to be more specific, press Shift, and we can control ourselves, in theory, as long as you let go of Shift. Keep grabbing the mod wheel. So we can set it to control our filter as well, which is actually smart. It's part of the MPE type thing. But if we're after that kind of feel, as we push up, we can open our filter a little bit, which is really rather cool. We can set our velocity to envelope. So that allows us a level of performance control that we commonly didn't get at this time. Whether that's on a Juno 60 or not, I'm not sure, but if you're looking for a little bit more feeling of movement, and this is the same thing with volume. And that's how we end up with really lovely, warm-feeling synth performances. And to be perfectly honest, it took me a long time to understand that I would be struggling away with all performance controls turned off because, oh, too much information, man. And then wondering, how do these guys get such lovely, rich sounds compared to my sound? Because everything about my basic sound seems right, but theirs is better. And it's probably because they've got a little bit of performance control. So that transforms our sound quite a lot, and it keeps it moving as we're playing it, which makes it much more engaging. So don't bypass these for too long. We have that arpeggiator. Hold it. Look, Ma, no hands. I can't remember what that does. Silly me. It doesn't matter. There's a manual for that. Locking to your sync and host and what have you. Different modes. Normal as played means that it will take the notes in the order in which I play them. So. Random, picks them out. It's a different form of the up and down thing. Again, just such a lovely fill to give you movement inside a piece. The arpeggiator is nice. Take a little bit of time to understand it, and don't forget not only the lower speeds with their odd timings. Sitting inside a more rigid timing, that offset timing will roll beautifully or sound horribly broken. So these can be used as to get those sounds and those feels, and including as using them as a lead. So if I want my fluty sound to have a vibrato to it, sorry, not a vibrato, a tremolo to it. I can set that up. You've got to work out how to control that and where it needs to go inside your MIDI, but very nice. We'll turn that off. Key transpose. So we can move things by semitones in case we want to play in a different key whilst still playing in C major, or the whole octave. You've also got and there are times on record where you would hear these switches being used. I think I talked about that with the Mercury 4 with which is much easier to do in person than over software. We can change our polyphony up to 12. So the original instrument had 6 voices. This will allow you to have up to 12. 12 being a good number because it solves the voice stealing of 6. 6 allows you to play 3, but we've got voice stealing straight away. If we increase this, there's voice stealing. Go up to 12. We're not chopping those previous notes off. Of course, the higher you go, the more CPU usage you might have, but it seems pretty civilized. Yeah, I'm not getting more than 1 bar, which, oh, you can't see, but I'm not getting more than 1 bar, which means it's not using much anything. So in terms of CPU usage, very, very reasonable. Overall level, you can push pretty hard. You can detune the whole instrument. Now, if you've got several versions of this running at the same time, let's say we've got a nice string line, then we can instance a second version of this, copy the patch across, drag one of them low, drag one of them high, and suddenly we've got a real natural chorus, which is better than unisoning and better than chorusing. So seeing we're in the digital world, brilliant. Also, if you happen to be working with something or somebody who has a different version of tuning from you, singers, then you can always adjust to suit them. So nice little thing. You don't always see it on especially affordable VST, so it's nice to have it. And then just that pitch wheel. Keyboards you can keep or not keep. I kind of like having it there. There are 1 or 2 things that you lose the ability to see, like the LFO trigger if you make it go away. As bonus, and I see these only as bonus, but they are nice. There are implementations of TAL's delay thing. They don't get into having modulation on them, but possibly for the better in this instance. And reverb. So again, implementation most likely over his Reverb 4, and it's nice for on board. They have a real character, so that you're going to want or not want them when it comes to the mix, but they do work nicely in the piece, which you can listen to at the end of this. I used no external effects whatsoever. There's one instance of TAL's 4, Reverb 4, and one of his delay, the Dub X delay, I always forget the actual name of it, and they're on the send, and no other effects. Where I felt like I needed to bully up a sound, then I used chorus or a little bit of these guys. And hear how nice and rich a sound that is, and that's just a saw. Really nice. That, I think, has covered basically everything there is to cover. Oh, no, sorry, I did promise you this, and this is a real positive about a couple of his instruments where it's there. Now, this is DCO, meaning now our oscillators are locked and in tune, and everything should be locked in tune and exactly as we expect it to be. Very VST. However, he gives us the ability to service it, which is your service control, and we can set how we want each of our voices to be voiced. So if we hit random, we'll see that now the cutoff position and our tuning for each of these voices and the rates on our attacks, decays, releases, this looks like pan's an option as well, has been offset. So we can make our instrument quite drunk. That's a bit horrid. But we get this extra richness. That's probably that guy there. So this is a real little ace in the hole, where you take the instrument and you give it that randomness of each voice is behaving differently. This is like thinking in the old days of a voice card. So each card is a bit different from the others. We end up with this extra niceness that just makes the most of the really nice sound in here. So bottom line, if you haven't already worked out, I like this. I like this a lot more than I thought I was going to, because I came in thinking limited architecture, the bloody Stranger Things sound. But no, it's actually a lovely synth with a lot more going on for it than you might think. And I expect to probably use it in my arsenal. I may have to remind myself to use it because I'm so sort of Thor Europa subtractor kind of thing, and I've thought subtractor handles this really nicely, but you know, there are things that it just doesn't do because this is optimized to do those things. So we'll move you back to hearing the full revoiced track. So that was the TAL sampler track, which is going to be an album track. The piece is revoiced using only TAL-U-NO-LX version 2 sounds, with the exception of those drums. You have a great day. If you have any broad questions, pop them down below, preferably after hitting the subscribe button. You have a great day now.